It's next my great pleasure to introduce and welcome back great friend, Keele World Affairs. Michael Clarke has been visiting us for 20 years, is my guess, and he's also, as a member of the advisory panel, has been hugely helpful in us identifying and bringing other very interesting people in this whole area of national security. And could that topic be more important than today? I won't go into Michael's background because time is running on and it's time to hear from him. Welcome back.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I spend my time a lot in the London policy and the media bubble, and it is so nice to come here, as I do I guess most years, and just see you. This is the real Britain, and it's a privilege. And it's also an honour to be asked to come to what is Bill's valedictory event, and it's an honour that I really hope I can live up to. But it's lovely. I love it. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. And so here we are. This is you. This is where we live. In Shakespeare's Richard II, he has John of Gaunt make a long speech about this, which is one of the brilliant passages in Shakespeare's text. And he says it's the royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this precious stone set in a silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. Very romantic view of Britain, not England, but Britain. But what he says about this precious stone set in a silver sea was true in Shakespeare's day. It is in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house. And it performed in that role right through to the 20th century, the Second World War, to the end of the Cold War. That was the moat defensive to a house. And it's still there, but it doesn't perform the function anymore of a moat or a wall defensive to a wall or a moat defensive to a house, because it's now part of our security. It's the area of cables and pipelines and transit ships. It has some great advantages, but it's also responsibility. It isn't just our defense, it's part of our responsibility. And there's something else about this as well, which is that when I see this, I mean, like most of you, I think, I was born in those years, not long after the Second World War, and this to me was Britain. This was it. This was where I lived, and that's the way I saw it. And so I also, when I see this, and I love these aerial photographs, these satellite images, when I see it, I get a sort of emotional little twinge, because that's it. This is our country. This is my country. This is my territory. And there is a bit of an emotional twinge. But as a person born not long after the Second World War, I now live in a political environment which is completely different. Completely different. And so we now have to embrace, in this section of our lives, I know there are younger people in the audience, I'm glad there are, but we now have to embrace a really different future, which is not necessarily worse, but it's certainly going to be rocky for the next period. And so I wanted to just outline that future a little bit. And the future revolves around, and I've said this before, and I think I've used this slide before in these lectures, the Big Four. The Big Four of the world, they make the political weather for everybody else. So the United States, China, India, and Russia. They're the Big Four. They're big for different reasons. China is big because of its potential and its population. Russia is far and away the weakest of the Big Four, but it nevertheless is one of the Big Four because of what it does, how it behaves, the sheer size of the place, and so on. Those are the Big Four. And that's not so surprising, but what's so important to Europe, and particularly to Britain, is that 3 of those Big Four are revisionist states. They're trying to change the system. So Russia has been trying to change the system since, well, quite a long time, but certainly actively change it since Putin got to power in 1999, and after about 2008, he's been very actively trying to undermine the system for something else. Xi Jinping became the leader, the chief in China in 2012, and he talked very specifically about the revisionist agenda, about creating a new world order. And President Trump, he's trying to change the system. The United States, which basically built the system with a lot of European input, a lot of British input, the United States, which was a lot of the system, he wants to change it as well, for all sorts of reasons that we could talk about. So 3 of the big 4 are revisionists, which is very, very uncomfortable for Europe, because we are the system. We were the old system. It's our principles and our views that have given us 200 years of very favourable outcomes in world politics generally, and that is now changing. You can argue it should change, of course, but it's changing now more rapidly than ever before. And the other thing about this is not just that 3 of those 4 are revisionists. 2 out of the 4 are rogue states. We used to say that rogue states were states like North Korea, Syria under Assad, Libya under Gaddafi, Iraq under Saddam Hussein. They were the rogue states of the world. But now Putin, Russia, is a rogue state. It's been a rogue state pretty actively for the last decade, trying to undermine things, illegality of all sorts, anything it can do to break the rules to its own advantage. And the second rogue state is now the United States. So both Russia and the US are now rogue states. So rogue states now are not just the basket cases who are just a damn nuisance to the system. 2 of the 4 are behaving like rogue states. And that may not last in America's case, but I mean, I would give you this is not a term of abuse. I could give you a long and strong argument as to why, under President Trump, the United States is behaving like a rogue state. May not last, may be short-lived, but that's where we are at the moment. So this is a very uncomfortable time, and this leaves Europe having to face some astonishing new realities. Now, none of these realities have come so suddenly. Europe, I mean, all the analysts in Europe knew we were heading for a different sort of future that would change, but we thought it was a glide path. It might be an uncomfortable glide path, but we thought it was a glide path of maybe 20, perhaps 30 years. In the 2030s, 2040s, things will be different. And what has happened since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and President Trump's first term and then his second term, and then the development of Xi Jinping's China and the direction that that is taking, is that that glide path has become a cliff edge. So it's not that we didn't anticipate most of these things, not all, but it's not that we didn't anticipate most of these things, but we thought we had more time to adjust. And now we're facing a series of cliff edges, which creates this very uncomfortable feeling that the world is somehow collapsing around us and we're desperately holding on to the things that really matter to us. And so in terms of Britain, we've got 2 big issues, President Trump and Vladimir Putin. So let me deal with Russia first. Vladimir Putin, he's not a hard man to work out. He's not a very clever man, but he's very cunning. And he's relatively consistent. I mean, when the Cold War came to an end in 1991, he was KGB chief in Dresden. I mean, he wasn't even a big shot in the KGB. He was KGB chief in a small German city in Dresden. And he was appalled by what happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, just collapsed, overnight it seemed. And he never forgave Gorbachev for bringing it to collapse. Gorbachev never intended that to happen, but that's what happened. He never forgave him for that. And he thought it was a historic injustice. And the point about Putin is that his views have never really changed. And there's no mystery about them. He's written about them. He's given speeches about them. If you're interested, there's a very famous paper, a really rambling 8,000-word paper that he produced in July 2021, which is all about his view of Russian history and what the Russians were entitled to and so on. If you want to read it, it's all there. You can get it on the internet. What has changed is not his views, but his power. And so he's gone from local KGB chief to apparatchik in Petersburg to sort of criminal fixer in Petersburg, then to the Moscow organization, then into government in Moscow, and then to be made prime minister by Boris Yeltsin, and then taking over effectively in 1999, using the Chechen War as by stimulating the Chechen War, the Second Chechen War, which was KGB. I mean, the KGB blew up. They killed about 300 people by blowing up flats, apartments in Moscow and other cities and blamed it on the Chechens, and it wasn't. It was the KGB who did it. Absolutely. I mean, I can give you proof about that. And that's what they did. They created the outrage, Second Chechen War, and that cemented his power. And what we've seen since is a growth in his power to what it is now. And like all dictators, he lives by warfare. He's been in power now for 26 years. He's on his 5th war, right? So this war is the 5th. And he has to live by warfare. That's the nature, usually, of dictatorship. Now, 2 things about Putin that are really important in terms of what he believes. First thing is that he talks about containment. You know, containment, this Cold War policy that the West had. When I was a young student, my first essays in the late 60s were about containment. I had to go and research the architects of containment, like Harriman and Keenan, and the articles they wrote. And containment was a really clever, balanced strategy for how the West should respond to the Soviet Union after the Second World War. So for us, containment is something that started in 1947-48 and then grew in importance in the 40s and 50s. And it was generally speaking, a very successful strategy that worked. So for us, containment goes from then. He says, explicitly, he said, containment didn't start in the 1940s. Containment started in the 18th century. Because the West, Europe, the guts of Western Europe has always been trying to push Russia back. The West always fears Russia. They always try to undo Russia's historic mission as part of a civilizational role which Russia has. So containment isn't a modern thing. Containment's a very ancient thing. That's his view. That's the view he takes. And the second thing he believes, very, very specifically, and he's said it many times, he said, we don't believe in peaceful coexistence. Because every time the Russians have engaged in peaceful coexistence, they lose. And that's true. That's true too. And that goes back to Alexander I in the 19th century. Every time the Russians, as it were, try to be like the West Europeans, they lose because they can't then handle the domestic demands and the turbulence that creates. And of course, what he says, well, that's because we're always trying to undermine them. What we say is, well, that's because there's something a bit wrong in your internal politics. If you can't live with growing democratic societies on your borders, maybe you should think about what it is you're offering your people. But that's the problem. The Russians, in his view, they oppose us not because of what we do, because of what we are. Just like the jihadists. They always look for reasons. They're always trying to grasp for things that the West does that they want to respond to. But that's not it. They oppose us for what we are, not for what we do. And so does Putin. And so we've got in Russia a leader who thinks completely differently to the way Western leaders think. So he's not an irrational man, but he is a man who is on different historic and emotional tram lines in terms of what he thinks Russia is and what Russia history should be. Now, I love historic maps, and I love this one. I mean, this is Europe in 1207, Europe in 1789, Europe in 1960, and Europe in 2012. And what you see from this is that there is no settled pattern to Europe. Europe is like a kaleidoscope. It's always says, look how much it changes. Interestingly, the bit that changes least is the royal throne of kings. That turns out to be the most stable part in terms of territorial switching. So not to worry too much about this, but the point I make is that there is no obvious set of boundaries in Europe. And this was the Europe that President Putin knew when he was an 8-year-old boy. This was Europe then. And Moscow had the Soviet Union, all the territories of the Soviet Union, plus domination of Poland and East Germany right through down to Greece, down to the Adriatic. Down to the Mediterranean. And that was the Iron Curtain. And what Putin now sees in 2012 is that security boundary for Moscow is now 1,000 miles closer to Moscow. 1,000 miles. And that really worries him. And we say, look, it's only territory. These countries are all democratic countries. What's your problem? No, he doesn't see it that way. For him, this is the West coming nearer to his capital. And that's why he thinks that there is, in his case, a genuine sense of constant threat, which he can't sort of get out of his mentality. So that's what we're up against in that respect. And something else. This is Medvedev, who you might remember sort of interchanged with Putin as president, prime minister, president. Medvedev is a drunk. He has an alcohol problem. And he's out of the main decision makers now, though he's on the chairman of the National Security Council, but nobody really at the top takes too much notice of him. But he tries to ingratiate himself with the top by saying outrageous things, outrageously aggressive things. But one thing he was saying about 6 months ago was very apposite. He said that NATO's motto is peace through strength. Peace through strength. And that's true. That's NATO's motto, peace through strength. He said, we don't believe in peace through strength. We believe in peace through fear. Peace through fear. Because fear works. We see it works. That's what he said. And he's right. It does work. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russians have made a lot of people in Europe frightened of them. So a lot of the people in southern Europe are quite frightened. A lot of the German population is very nervous. He says, we make fear work. And what they mean by that is that the Russians only feel secure if their neighbors fear them, or if their neighbors are weak. They don't want to live next door to powerful, strong, stable societies. By and large, because, we would say, they can't take the competition. They would say, because you're always trying to undermine us. You can't help yourselves. You can't help yourselves from enlarging. And so that's the Russia that we effectively face. And, of course, we face it now in the front line of Ukraine. And just looking at Ukraine, that's the map we've all got used to, this sort of semicircle. I always think Ukraine looks like a kitchen clock. Imagine a sort of an oval kitchen clock, sort of an elongated oval. And that sort of goes from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. That's the map that we've all been fairly used to. But just look at a couple of other things. This is the map of Ukraine, as it were, since the invasion of 2022. It looks as if there's lots of water up here. It isn't. It's just the colour blue. The blue represents the areas that the Ukrainians have taken back, the areas that they've liberated. And you see, so this is the area that the Russians all occupied at one time or another, all the way down there. And the blue areas represent where the Ukrainians have liberated their own territory, right through to there, and they've taken half of Kherson back. So the Ukrainians overall are doing not at all badly, but of course they're up against a power which is doing everything now to grind forward. Something else that the Ukrainians have done is they've thrown the Russians out of Sevastopol. They've actually taken control of the western part of the Black Sea. And so the Russian fleet has gone to Novorossiysk and also to Ochimira. I mean, the Russians are building a new port. This is Russia, of course. So they've taken their fleet basically back to safety in Novorossiysk. And this port at Ochimira is actually in Georgian territory. It's part of the territory that the Russians seized in 2008. It doesn't even belong to them. It's Abkhazia. Legally, it's Georgia, but they don't care about that. They're building a port there for their fleet. And the point here is that the Ukrainians have been able to keep their lines open, their merchant marine going, traveling from Odessa and Chornomorsk and so on, down through the Bosphorus into the Mediterranean and out into the avenues of world trade. So when we talk about Ukraine being on the back foot, being pushed back all the time, that's true. But remember that they've scored quite a big strategic victory in the western Black Sea without a navy. They've actually destroyed about 1/3 to 1/2 of the Russian Black Sea fleet, and the Ukrainians don't have a navy. So they've done it in all sorts of interesting ways, and they've kept their lifeline open after 4 years. So they're not doing so badly in that respect. But one thing they do suffer from is air attacks, and these are Russian drone and missile strikes during the first half of 2025. And you see there, these are the number of strikes day by day by day by day. And you see there from May 2025, June 2025, it builds up and builds up and builds up to these strikes of 700-800 or so in one night. I mean, drone strikes and missile strikes. And the Ukrainians are bringing down hundreds and hundreds of drones every night. And 3 drones were fired at Akrotiri in Cyprus, and we couldn't bring down one. 2 of them fell short, and 1 got through. And the Ukrainians are bringing down hundreds every night. So there you go. But the Russians are really putting pressure on in terms of their drone and missile strikes over the winter. And these lines here, you don't need to worry about these, but the point they make is it doesn't matter where international diplomacy is. It doesn't matter where the talks are and the peace process. They ignore it. They just keep on building up the number of strikes that they can create. So that's where we are with the war as it is. And final point on this, on the Russian aspect of the threat, is that the Russians are involved in hybrid warfare against all of the Western Europe, not America now so much, but certainly Western Europe. And what we mean by hybrid warfare is using everything they can. So cyber attacks, social media manipulation, trying to get involved in elections, support to political parties that they approve of, including in Britain, sabotage, professional sabotage, also getting youngsters, giving them some money and for a bit of fun, planting incendiaries in anywhere really, but particularly warehouses and so on. And they're giving themselves lots of levers that they can pull in the event of a major crisis. Now, I offer this simply as one example. There's any number of things we could talk about, but this is one example. So these are the cables in the Baltic Sea, really important cables for the economies of the Baltic countries. And here are the disruptions to the cable, there and there, and there and there, and there, down here. And they think that this is all supposed to be an accident. All right? This is all supposed to be coincidental. Well, of course it isn't. And so we live with this constant hybrid threat. The military sometimes call it sub-threshold. It's everything up to the level of real violence. And at some point, it's probably going to tip over towards real violence in ways that I could explain later on if you're interested. So we're under real pressure from Russia's long-term thinking about what we are and who they are, and short-term pressure in terms of what the Ukraine crisis represents, and the fact that the Russians feel now that they have an opportunity to really split Europe from the United States, which is not difficult just at the moment, and to undermine the defences of Europe in some fairly fundamental ways. So that's one sort of threat, one side of the threat. And this is the other side of what has changed, President Trump. And of course, you could spend all night talking about this, but let me just focus on one thing. I mean, at the moment, given the war in Iran, he uses this phrase frequently now that Keir Starmer is no Churchill. Right? And he goes out of his way. When he was talking to the Irish Prime Minister, he just went out of his way to veer off and talk about how annoyed he is with Britain and so on. And he goes again, he said it, I think 3 times, maybe 4 times now, that Keir Starmer is no Churchill. To which the response is, and you're no Roosevelt, pal. Roosevelt was a president who made the world that you're busy undermining. Roosevelt was a man of vision. And this comes down to something very important for NATO. NATO has been through lots of crises in its years. Crisis of Suez in the 1950s and Vietnam in the 1960s. A crisis about nuclear weapons. Remember the cruise and Pershing missiles controversy in the 1980s. And the Iraq War of 2003, very, very controversial. So NATO has been through lots of those problems. But NATO always comes back to the middle point again for 2 reasons. One is that there is a sense amongst NATO members that we share common values. That was important. And the second reason was that we share a common outlook on world politics. We basically see the world in the same way. Those 2 things always brought NATO back together again after the most dreadful rows that we've had over the last 60 or 70 years. And in this respect, let me talk to you about one particular moment when the relationship pre-NATO, the relationship between Britain and the United States was really fixed. And that was the attack on Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. Let me just tell you about that. December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor. They attacked at dawn on the Sunday. 7th of December was a Sunday. They attacked at dawn. The 7th of December, Sunday morning in Hawaii, was Saturday night in Britain. And Churchill was at Chequers on that Saturday night, as he tended to do. He went there with some friends. And Harriman was there, Avril Harriman, and Guy Winant, the ambassador, their wives were there. Lord Ismay were there, Pug Ismay and his wife, and a couple of others. And they had a meal, they had their evening meal. It was a fairly sort of downbeat affair. Nobody was very cheerful. And then people left the table, drifted away at the end of the meal. And Churchill stayed at the table with Harriman and Winant and Ismay. And they shared brandy and cigars, just chatted into the evening. And then at 9 o'clock, Churchill had a little radio, a novelty at the time, a small radio. And he had this little, and he put it on the table, and he switched it on for the 9 o'clock news. And they got an item that said there's been an attack at Pearl Harbor. And they looked at each other and said, that can't be true. That's got to be a mistake. And And they were just dumbfounded. And Harriman said, oh, it must be misplaced. Or it's been an explosion, an accident of some sort. It's misreported. And they were just looking at each other. And then somebody came running in from the communications room, said, the Japanese have attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor, act of war. And the whole place, the whole of Chequers, you can imagine, just exploded into activity immediately. And Churchill, in his memoirs, is very interesting about this. Everyone was running around making phone calls, great activity, excitement, great sort of moment. And he said, and he described some of this, and he said, you will forgive me if I admit that I did all of this with a sense of joy in my heart, because I knew at that moment we'd won. However bad it was, whatever difficulties lay ahead, we had won the war. He said, because the Americans were now with us, up to the neck and into the death. That's what he said, up to the neck and into the death. They were his phrases. And then, of course, he got very Churchillian in his memoirs, all the purple prose. He said, I knew at that moment that Britain would live, British Empire and the Commonwealth would live, our island story would not come to an end, typical Churchillian stuff. And then he finishes his account by saying, I finally went to bed and I slept the sleep of the saved and the grateful. And the reason he could feel saved and grateful were these two reasons. Because what the Americans did, they were attacked in the Pacific. What did they do? They sent most of their troops to the Atlantic. They sent most of their forces to Europe, having been attacked in the Pacific. That's an astonishing strategic decision to make, which Roosevelt made. Why did he make that decision? He didn't make it just because he liked Churchill, because they were sentimental about Britain. Because A, this was ideological, that sooner or later the liberal democracies had to stand up to the fascists. So that was the ideological cement. And B, he saw the world in the same way the British saw the world. We must finish off fascism in Europe, and then we can turn to the lesser problem of Japanese imperialist fascist aggression, which is very serious, but less serious than what is happening in Europe. So hit it in Europe first, get that out of the way, hold on in the Pacific, see what we can do, and then transfer our forces to the Pacific and really finish them off. So there were the two things. Common values and a common ideology and a common geopolitical outlook. And those two things have kept NATO in good shape all through the years since 1945, 1949, until now. And here are the two things that show that that's not anymore the case. Now, this may change, but these are the documents that we've got now. This is the National Security Strategy of the US, came out in November 2025. And what this national security strategy said is that henceforth, the Americans won't be ideological at all. We take a negative view, and that is, we take no view about the politics of any other society. We accept that the world is the way it is. We just are concerned with what's good for the American people, and we will be morally neutral. And that goes throughout the document until the 3 pages on Europe. And when it gets to the 3 pages on Europe, it says Europe is facing civilization decline, civilization eclipse because of immigration. It says it there in the documents in black and white. And they said, we oppose that, and we will throw our weight behind those truly democratic forces in Europe, by which they mean the AfD in Germany, Fidesz in Hungary, Reform in Britain. We'll throw our weight behind those forces who are trying to create proper free speech against major European governments who are suppressing free speech, by which they mean Germany and France and the United Kingdom. It's an astonishing 3-page attack on the ideology of liberal democracy as we practice it. It's an astonishing attempt to undermine our liberal democracies in favor of the Christian nationalist version of democracy, which presently is all the rage in MAGA America. Now, it may not be this way forever, and these documents may fade into become sort of foolish footnotes in history. We don't know. But that's where we are at the moment. So that was the national security strategy, and that, in black and white, undermines the common ideological values between Europe and the United States. And then we've got the national defense strategy, which came out at the end of January, and this does the other one. This actually demolishes the common geopolitical view between the United States and Europe. Because what this says is that the United States will pursue a partnership with Russia. Right? A proper partnership. Never mind that the Russians have broken international law, have invaded another country, are behaving in a genocidal manner. Don't worry about that. We want a partnership. And the war in Ukraine is just something that's arisen. It's everybody's fault. Who's to blame? You deal with it. The Europeans must deal with the war in Ukraine while we pursue our Russian partnership and our interests elsewhere. So there you are. There could be nothing more telling of the difference in perception between the geopolitical view that Washington takes and the view that almost all of the, certainly North European countries take. So, those two fundamental principles that have held NATO together at the moment, are completely undermined by the official policy of the Trump administration. I'm choosing my words carefully because, official policy may alter, after the midterms in November, or it may not. These documents may turn out to be not so relevant, or they may. All I'm saying is that's where they are at the moment, and if you think I'm exaggerating, download them, read them, see what you think. And so we've got a NATO which is in some trouble. This is a map of NATO, where there's the United States, Canada, Iceland, and then all of the countries with the dates on which they joined NATO. And the point here is that NATO began as 12 nations, then it became 15, then 16, and then it was 16 nations for many years. And then after the Cold War, it suddenly went from 16 to 32. It doubled in size. And by and large, NATO didn't really want to extend itself much, but these countries wanted to come in because they thought that coming into NATO would get them an American security guarantee and was part of a route into the European Union, so they could be secure and prosperous the way their West European countries and neighbours had been for a long time. Almost all of these new entrants didn't really add very much militarily, except Poland. Poland, important country which does add real value to NATO. Most of these other southern European countries actually added commitments, but not very much more. The other country that's really added something is Finland. Came in 2023. They are tough guys. They are, and they really are. They're a net benefit to NATO's military posture. But NATO has doubled in size since the Cold War and is not nearly as strong militarily as it used to be. So that's the situation that we find ourselves in. So here, and I apologize for this a little bit, I had this map commissioned at Sky for one thing we were doing a few weeks ago, and I couldn't get the slide individually to download, so I had to do a screenshot of me standing like a sort of demented magician at the side of it. But what it was about was that and this is just we call this Michael's map. Now, this is not a proper map, this is Michael's map. So this is my version of what I think NATO is moving towards. So I think we've got sort of three categories. There's a sort of northern NATO group, who are the toughies, the ones who take NATO very seriously, more so than even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And they consist of Canada and Iceland, the United Kingdom, the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, maybe France. I'm not sure, because France is both northern and southern. I mean, France, by and large is a northern state, but not always. And so those are the northern states, and those look like the old NATO in effect. But then there's another group who are the southern NATO group, and they tend to be in southern Europe. So the Iberian states, Italy, and the Baltic, the states in the southeastern Europe around the Balkans, Turkey, they are much, much less committed. And they are not really NATO in the way that we used to understand NATO. And then, of course, there's Article 5 commitment. We don't know if the United States takes any of this seriously anymore. Are they really committed to Article 5 or not? We just don't know. So that's the sort of NATO we're facing. And here we are in Britain thinking, what do we do about this? This was the Ministry of Defence's page from the Strategic Defence Review of last year, which I certainly wasn't involved in the policy making for it, but I was involved in some of the discussions around it, some of the working groups we had for the MOD, where we looked at my group. We had 20 discussion groups, and I was chairing group number 1, which was about 5 people, and I won't tell you who the other 4 were, but they were very, very highly placed people, and we were discussing what the world would look like in 2035 and 2050, what we thought the threats would be. And the SDR, Strategic Defence Review, came out last year. And this is the government's official take on it. This is what they said it would do. We would move to war-fighting readiness. Not just have forces that can do things, but war-fighting readiness. That by investing in defence, that will be an engine for growth. It's not the best engine for growth. It's not the best if there are other engines of growth. But if you've got to defend yourself for other reasons, you might as well try and get some growth out of it as well. It will be NATO first. Our forces will be designed for NATO. Whether the Americans are in or out, we have no choice. It's got to be NATO. UK innovation will be driven by the lessons from Ukraine, and it will be a whole-of-society approach. This is not just about the military, this is about society. Going back to the idea that we have got to be resilient against cyber attacks, against outages and shortages if the Russians try to create them. We've got to be more prepared to mobilize, as it were, a reserve force of civilians who, in the event, might have to turn out on a domestic front, not Dad's army, let me say, but something more modern than that, which would perform not dissimilar functions. So this is what the Strategic Defence Review said last year. And the problem is we've done almost nothing about it. It was a 10-year programme, and that 10-year programme, we've wasted the first year. It was 2025 to 2035, and there's no sense of urgency, there's no sense of drive, and the Ministry of Defence is lacking. It's not lacking leadership itself, it's got military leadership, it's got political leadership through John Healey, but it's lacking governmental push because the government's got lots of other issues. And here is the, here is the epitome of the situation we're in. There's HMS Dragon. Okay, easy to spot that one, Type 26 with a dragon on the front. HMS Dragon, which has finally been deployed to help defend Cyprus. It's not there yet. It left Portsmouth a few days ago. That photograph was taken on the 17th of March, which was Tuesday, and it's in Gibraltar. Stops in Gibraltar because that's where they take on their weapons. All our weapon stores for the Navy are in Gibraltar, where they're safely stored in the caverns there. And they need their Aster missiles, they're very good missiles, the Sea Viper system with Aster missiles. That's where they keep them, in Gibraltar. So I knew it would stop there, so it stopped there for a day. And Gibraltar to Cyprus is still 1,800 miles at an average speed of, say, 18 knots, which is probably what it's doing, might be a bit faster. It's still 100 hours sailing away. So it's now probably 50 to 60 hours sailing away. So another couple of days at least before it arrives in Cyprus. And this crisis in the Iranian war has exposed, most embarrassingly, Britain's threadbare defences at the moment. It couldn't come at a worse time, particularly for the Navy. Air Force is doing better out of it, but the Navy is having a really, really hard time. So that's where we are at the moment. We know what we should be doing. We've set it out very clearly. I've known defence reviews since before 1991. I go back to the 1980s when I was involved a little bit at the fringes of defence reviews. There have been a few of them since then. This is far and away the best I have ever known intellectually. It's the most honest, the most tough, the most scary in a way, but it is a realistic assessment of where we are. But there you are, we're just not doing it. So this is the area that we're most interested in now. And that's why I like these sort of satellite photographs. There's a Shatt al-Arab waterway that we worry about. There's the Strait of Hormuz that we worry about. There's the Shatt al-Arab waterway. So there's Iraq, there's Iran, there's Bahrain, there's Qatar, there's the United Arab Emirates, there's Oman, there's Saudi Arabia. And look ahead of this, right? North of that, you've got Turkey. North of that, you can just see there's the Black Sea. So there is Ukraine, there is Russia, there are the Transcaucasian states like Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Beyond that, there is Russia proper. And then on this side of the Caspian Sea, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, right through Afghanistan, Pakistan. This is one of the drivers it's one of the engines of the world economy. One of the engines of the world economy. From this Southwest Asia, we get food, we get fertilizer for food, we get fuel in oil and gas, we get petrochemicals. It is a center for international banking, it's a center for transport, it's a center for a lot of things. It's one, not the only one, but it's one of the main engines of drivers for the world economy. And at the moment, one component of that engine, the Strait of Hormuz, is stuttering. And in a way, it's a bit like sport, that when in sport, when the ball lands just inside the line or just outside the line, or somebody's foot goes into touch at the wrong moment, and the whole match hinges, a championship, the World Cup itself, whatever it is, hinges on that tiny, tiny moment. Sometimes sport is like that, and sometimes war is like that. And so the future of so much of this engine of international growth and the international economy hinges on this little bit of water here, 21 miles, the size of the channel, called the Strait of Hormuz. And as an example, just as a vignette really, of the new world, is that's been a trouble spot, a potential trouble spot for 40 or 50 years. We've always known it, now it is, and it will never, never be the same again. The Strait of Hormuz will never be as free and easy after the last 2 weeks going forward. Because whoever is in power in Tehran, and Tehran's about there, whoever is in power in Tehran will know now that they can close effectively the Strait of Hormuz just by making it dangerous. And that if there's no other outcome to this Iran war, that's the outcome that will last now forever. So I just use it as a vignette of how rapidly things are changing. And so here we are. I still got the emotional buzz from that vision of Britain and the United Kingdom. In my head, I know that I can't stick with that. In my head, I know I've got to see it in this way. This is the one that really matters. And there we are. Europe is not such a big place. There are the steppes of Asia. This is the sort of, these are the issues that we need to concern ourselves with, what's going on here and here, in order to be more secure in what's going on here and here. But still, of course, I'm a bit attached. Even though my head says I should think this way, in my heart, I still want to think that way. And I suppose in my head, I've been thinking this way probably for 10 or 15 years. And in my heart, I don't want to let go of this one. But I still do in a way. So I go back to Shakespeare. On Bill's valedictory night, the very last play he wrote was Two Noble Kinsmen. He did it with John Fletcher. It never used to be regarded as part of the Shakespearean canon, but recently it has been. It's known that he did write it with John Fletcher between 1612 and 1614. I mean, he died in 1616, so it was very, very late. And it's not done very often, the Two Noble Kinsmen, mainly because it's not very good. But it's about two Athenian warriors who are great friends, and then they fall out over a woman. And the whole thing gets confused, and it becomes a tragicomedy. That's what it is, a tragicomedy. And you can see when you read it, the bits that were obviously written by Fletcher and the bits that were clearly written by Shakespeare. And the last passage, the long last passage, just like the chorus in Henry V at the very end of the play, is Shakespeare talking to his audience. There are certain times when he uses his character, and you know it's him talking to us. Shakespeare, the man who understands me best, I always think. And there he is, in his very last play, and his last two lines, and I offer them in Bill's valedictory evening. His last two lines are, "Ourselves and all our might rest at your service. Gentlemen, good night."
Thank you, everyone. Lots of questions that you've submitted. Thank you so much. I'll do my best. There are microphones available. We'll try to fit them in if someone feels we're not covering the right ground. I'll start off with Jen Smith's question, Michael. And this is just asking you, if you look back, because you gave us a bit of a historical perspective, right? Looking back at the end of the Cold War, I mean, do you think there were some pivotal decisions or missed opportunities that shaped the more unstable world that we're now living in?
Yeah, there was one big trend at the end of the Cold War, which was that, and this was in Francis Fukuyama's book, famously the end of history. Remember that phrase, the end of history? And it was one of those phrases that went around the Washington policy establishment. He didn't know what he meant by it. He wrote it in an article, but this is the end of history, and it sort of grabbed the imagination, as things do in Washington, and everyone was talking about it. And so he had to write a book to explain what he meant. And his book was called The End of History and the Last Man. And what he was getting at is not that history was going to end, but that at the end of the Cold War, there was no alternative to liberal democracy. That liberal democracy was the default. People had tried other things. You tried fascism, you tried autocracy, you tried communism. None of them work. And you eventually fall back on some version of liberal democracy. So what he was saying is that, in a way, that the future of the world will be the speed and the style with which people adapt to liberal democracy, or some form of liberal democracy. So that was his sense that was what was going to happen. Of course, that's exactly what hasn't happened. And the liberal democracies are now a minority in the world. They were an endangered species. There's 200 states in the world. How many are really free-trading liberal democracies out of the 200? About 30, maybe. And not all of them are in the EU. Not all of them are in NATO. But I'd say about 30, depending on how you define it. and the number is getting smaller, not larger. So we're now, a generation later after Francis Fukuyama, an endangered species. And the problem, the general thing, one of the things that at the end of the Cold War was taken for granted, that everybody else would adapt to a sort of Western style. And when the Russians, as it were involved in Western diplomacy, we tried to involve Russia, and sometimes they were, as in the Balkan crisis of the 1990s. We sort of took Russian help and then said, okay, that's fine, thank you, that's all. And they felt offended and affronted. And so there was some gratuitous taking for granted of Russia at the time. Now, having said that, I don't think the Russian policy would have been significantly different, but we didn't try very hard to really integrate Russia into Western thinking. Now, and if I was an official sitting here, I'd tell you about all the Founding Act and the NATO-Russia coordination mechanism. Lots of things were done, but we didn't really do them with a big sense of heart. We sort of took the advantages and pocketed them and then got on with things on the assumption that the Russians would somehow come along. And we didn't understand the things I was talking about just now, about Putin and the Russian thinking of Russia. We didn't really understand the power of this group of Russians, this elite of Russians who've now got control of the country for the foreseeable future, how they thought. And then there was one other thing that you'll often hear in discussions and lots of the fellow travellers or the useful idiots, if you're going to be rude about them, who defend Russia and all the time. They say the West broke its promise. The West promised not 1 inch, that the West would not go 1 inch over the Cold War line. And look where they are now, 1,000 miles nearer to Moscow. The West never promised that. Let me tell you about this, the not 1 inch thing. It goes back to 1990. Secretary of State Baker was talking to Gorbachev about Germany, specifically about Germany, and they were negotiating as to whether the Russians would allow Germany to be reunited after the wall came down. And Baker said, at the end of negotiation, of a day of negotiation, before he went to bed, just as they were leaving to go to bed, he said to Gorbachev, how would you feel if we made some sort of declaration that we wouldn't go 1 inch over the border between East and West Germany now? How would that go down, do you think? I'll leave it with you. And he went to bed. And the following morning, he left early and went to Czechoslovakia. And now he exceeded his brief to even say that. The State Department immediately told him to take it back. That wasn't our negotiating position, said the Americans, and so on. So the Americans said, oh, he's a stupid bugger. He's done too much. He said too much. That's not what we mean. And Baker was on his tour of Czechoslovakia, sort of getting the plaudits for being the American Secretary of State when the Cold War had come down. He was off on one of his own. And Gorbachev wrote up what Baker said, and it mysteriously went into the Russian records as some sort of commitment. And when people say, you promised, the West promised, I say, I'll bet you, put any money you like on the table, £1,000, £10,000, £100,000, I will match it. If you can find me a document anywhere, a document in any Western policy organisation which says that, because I know I'm on safe ground, there isn't one. But we allowed that idea. I mean, Gorbachev did then agree to East and West Germany being united, and the Russians did get the idea that we'd made a commitment which we hadn't made, and we should have been clearer. That is not our commitment. Instead of which we just let it run because it was handy. That was a mistake.
I've got a series of questions that I've got a trajectory.
Sorry, I'll be briefer. Sorry.
If we could sort of quickly deal with Russia and Putin, and then we move on to all of the others. But these have a trajectory. So Peter Holcroft, did NATO validate Putin's ambition when they failed to act over Crimea? Yeah. And then it sort of moves on to, is North Korea still supplying troops to Russia? Yeah. And does the Middle East war affect that? And then we move on to the idea that Putin might not be as strong as we think he is. Joel Wells does the recent call from a previously pro-Putin blogger to put him on trial, show that he's actually a bit vulnerable. Yeah. And then I'll bring the last question when you sort of thought about that sort of trajectory. Would you like to
Sorry,
go ahead?
The fourth question was?
Well, I'll give you the fourth in a minute.
Oh, right, okay.
Thank you. I got in trouble with a much younger speaker by giving him too many questions.
On Crimea, 2014, the West was outraged by this. It was two invasions or two crises. One was in the February 2014 when Putin just grabbed Crimea and the Ukrainians were all at sea. They couldn't do anything about it and they sort of gave it away because they were confused. And the Russians suddenly said, okay, well, this is ours. And it was to do with the Black Sea Fleet and so on. And then 2 months later, this crisis began in the Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk. And it was the classic, Russian speakers could claim to be persecuted. Then the Spetsnaz came in and made it seem as if there were riots in the streets. And then the militias formed. And then the little green men, 5,000 of them were all on holiday together, apparently, all wearing combats, not with badges, but sort of outdoor gear that they'd all got from the same store, and they were all on holiday. And they took it over, and there it was. And they grabbed the third of the Donbass. That's about a third of Luhansk and a third of Donetsk. And that's the way it was. So 2014 ended up with 2 grabs, one in Crimea, which is the more serious one in retrospect, and the one in part of about a third of the Donbass. And the Western world thought this was outrageous. That was when the big sanctions began against Putin. But immediately, France and Germany began to look for a diplomatic solution. Britain ignored it. This was the Cameron government. We couldn't give a toss. And, we had guaranteed, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which the Ukrainians gave up the nuclear weapons they'd inherited from the old Soviet Union. They negotiated hard, and they received security guarantees from Britain, America, and Russia. And when they were invaded in 2014, we pretended we hadn't done anything. We had nothing to say. And so the French and the Germans came up with a Minsk process, Minsk I and Minsk II, which is meant to be a negotiated process to try to solve the problem of the Donbass. And neither of them worked, and the Russians just cheated on Minsk II. They claim the Ukrainians cheated. They did a bit, but the Russians actually undermined it. So the Ukrainian cheating ended up being a bit quite irrelevant. So the whole thing collapsed. So yes, the world did not react to Crimea, because look at what else was going on in 2014. There was ISIS, there was the Afghanistan crisis, the problems in the Middle East in general. There were other things crowding in, and this is just another example of the playground bully Putin. And the view was then, I took the view, and I think it was a good view to take at the time, Putin is a playground bully, he's a nuisance, but he will not be strategically important unless we let him be strategically important. And that was the view. I mean, he'll be a nuisance and they'll do things, but we can live with it. It's not worth a war. And of course, all that changed in 2022 when suddenly, there's no way back after the invasion of 2022. There's no way back for Russia, there's no way back for us. We'll never get back to that world in Europe. But what we were trying to hold on to was just the playground bully on the edge of the continent, or the edge of our active continent, who is just a nuisance. And that was the view. North Korea, yes, North Korean troops in Russia, some have turned up in Ukraine, but we think that they are, by and large, individuals, as Chinese troops have turned up in Ukraine as individuals. But there were certainly 13 or 14,000 North Korean troops in Kursk when the Ukrainians moved into Kursk as a sort of counterpunch. The North Koreans sent about 14,000, and they lost at least 4,000 of them. And there were numbers, they weren't very good, as you would expect. They weren't very good because they'd never fought anywhere else. They got better as time went on. And the issue is, would North Korea agree to put 40 or 50,000 troops into Ukraine that would make a difference? And if they did, that would be an invasion. That would be North Korea invading Ukraine. North Korea sending troops to Russia is okay, in the sense that you're sending troops to a friendly country who's asked for them. That's like us, sending British or German troops to Ukraine because they've asked for them, if we chose to. Sending North Korean troops into Russia, Kursk, is okay. Sending them into Donetsk or Luhansk or Zaporizhia, that's an invasion. And they haven't yet done that, although they might. And then finally, how strong is Putin? Well, we don't know. Always when dictators crack, they crack pretty quickly. The signs of crack, such as they are that the internet's been down now for a couple of weeks in Moscow and Petersburg because the Russians keep closing it down because they're worried about the amount of stuff that's getting through. Telegram channels, which are used by a lot of people in Russia, they've been closed down. And there is a sense in which even the elite of Petersburg and Moscow, let alone the Buryatians and people in the East who've been exploited all the time for this war, but the sophisticates of Petersburg and Moscow are grumbling that this war now, this special military operation, is impacting on their ability to hail cabs and do things on their phones and so on. And that's the sort of problem that will actually undermine a central government. But in other respects, Putin is tightening up all round. I mean, it's a more repressive place now, considerably more repressive than it was 4 years ago, even 2 years ago. So, Putin is strong internally, and there cannot be a popular revolution to unseat him because there's no avenues for people to come out on the streets. As and when he is unseated, it has to be the oligarchs around him who will do it. It's them. So when their interests really begin to be affected, it'll be the Julius Caesar answer for him. There'll be a knife in the back, either literally or figuratively. And Prigozhin tried that in 2023, the Wagner leader. And that's the point. If you're going to go for the Julius Caesar answer, you've got to make sure you hit it first time. There's never a second chance. He was never going to get a second chance. And he wasn't really clear what he was trying to achieve. So as and when the oligarchs turn on him, then whoever starts it has got to make sure they carry it through, politically or physically.
You mentioned Modi in the talk, Modi, but not in detail. So I would like to just sort of give you three questions here. I would just roll them into one to give your thoughts on India. So, Alistair Duncan, if of your four leaders, the only stable influence is Modi, should the UK be applying to join India's Commonwealth for our own security? And Chris Hall, why is Modi one of the big four, and what is the scale of India's influence? Gavin Idians, the non-revisionist India will benefit from the increase in world conflict, so which side will they take?
Yeah. Good questions, really good points. There's a real delicacy in British-Indian relations because of historical reasons. And a few things have happened. I mean, we talk about our close relationship with India, but any suggestion that we are taking them for granted or patronising or whatever, it goes down really, really badly. And so it's like walking on eggshells. Anyone in the Foreign Office will tell you that dealing with India is like walking on eggshells, but it is worth it because there's so much that we can do together, and India is a really important power. It's the greatest population in the world now. It's overtaken China, not in developmental terms, but in numerical terms, and it's going to be very important to the future. Also, I mean, the biggest single ethnic minority in Britain is the Indian minority. Everyone assumes it's probably the Pakistani minority. It isn't. It's not the Pakistani minority. It's the Indian minority who do very well. And they're very integrated. Nobody seems to have any problems with the Indian diaspora in Britain, very few. And they don't have many problems with us, and they form very good relationships with, all integrate in all sorts of ways that we all seem to find quite rewarding. And so, that's always something. It's a sort of silent integrative process, which is almost like the empire in reverse, and it works really well. And there's a lot to be done in terms of attracting Indian investment into Britain and Britain investing in India. But Modi is an out-and-out nationalist. With the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, which is extremely anti-Muslim, has taken a real grip on Kashmir and is undermining what's going on in Kashmir. Within India, Modi is regarded as an anti-democrat. I mean, he's still he's subject to the democratic process, but like Orban in Hungary, he will subvert it as much as he can, like Erdogan in Turkey. These are all democratic leaders who are learning how, or have learned how, to make democracy work so that they get successively re-elected, and that's what Modi seems to be doing. Not so easy in India because of the sheer size of the place as it is in Hungary or in Turkey, but that's what he's doing. And Britain has got to be careful about this, but there is a lot of common strategic interest because the Indians have become much more strategic with China's emergence onto the world stage militarily. And they talk about the string of pearls, which are the bases that China has got from the Malacca Straits through to Hambantota in Sri Lanka. They own that Hambantota, the port now. The Chinese own it, and right through to Djibouti in East Africa. And the Indians see that as encirclement. They see that China's bases are a way of encircling India, and there is a sense that at some point India and China might well start fighting a war at sea because of the struggle for influence. And for Britain, we've got to be very careful about that. But the Indians are reaching out they were reaching out to the Americans until Trump insulted Modi quite so badly. And that's kind of on hold now for a bit. But Japan, Australia, South Korea, India, Britain, and maybe the United States form a kind of a natural loose alliance to try to counterbalance growing Chinese pressure. And nobody denies China the right to be the sort of great power it's going to be, but we don't have to give in to Chinese bullying. That's the sort of general sense. Yeah.
Quick word on tech. May not be your specialist field, but Martin Drew, why can't the US say satellite system pinpoint the launch sites used by Iran?
So why can't it pinpoint the
launch sites?
Oh, the launch. Okay.
That Iran's got.
Reason for that. Yeah.
And then I've got another question, which I think is quite an unusual one from Terry Mahoney. How many of these cyber and pipeline attacks are US inspired, not Russian or Chinese? And will Britain go on the offensive in these areas? So would you like to just talk a little bit more about it?
So the pipeline disruptions are US inspired, is that the case?
Well, that's what he...
Is that the...
Is there any hint of...
Okay, yeah.
You can tell us whether there's any hint of that.
Okay, well...
whether Britain is really mobilised to deal with
Well,
that.
let me talk about the pipelines first. No, there's no evidence that the United States is behind these things because it wouldn't do them any good, to be honest. It really wouldn't. I mean, if you look at the pipelines, the cables, I mean, the transatlantic cables that come from North America, most of them come into landfall in Europe at Land's End. And that's a vulnerable spot. I mean, Britain kind of, is the sort of entry point for all the cables that then serve Europe. And the United States gets as much out of those cables as we do. So I mean, there's no real motive to do that. And I don't know of any evidence. I mean, maybe you do. Maybe you've got something, but I've not seen it, is all I would say. Why doesn't Britain do more about the pipelines? Because we've got no navy, is the issue. The Defence Secretary said about a month ago, he said, we are going to stop the dark fleet. The dark fleet of sanctions-busting ships which are going through the channel. We know who they are, we can see them. And they just go through the channel, carrying illegal oil, backwards and forwards. And the dark fleet varies from about 400 ships to about 1,200 ships, depending on when they go legal and when they don't. So ships go legally a few voyages, then they go dark, which they turn the transponders off and they start doing a bit of dark fleet work, and then they go legal again. So we're dealing with several hundred ships. John Healey has said, we're going to deal with this, and we are, but you've got to have a navy to do it. I mean, getting hold of one of these ships in the Channel or in the North Sea is dead easy. So you land Marines on the ship by air, by helicopter, you take over the ship, it's a civilian ship, you take it over, you bring it into a port, you send the crew home, or maybe put the captain on trial or whatever it might be, and you've got the ship. And you can argue about it for the next 20 years, and the ship is rusting away while you argue about it. And that takes the ship off the table, and the ship owners don't like it, so you can do something about it. So it's easy to do that bit. But the Russians are also escorting some of these ships with a frigate. And the fact is, if they will make any incident into a bigger incident, right? So we have to have enough force to deal with the bigger incident that they will transform it into. So it's not just a question of arresting a ship like a policeman. You've got to arrest the ship and then have a couple of frigates or destroying a frigate and a submarine on site to deter the Russians from saying, we're taking that back or else, because it will go to a naval incident, and we haven't got the ships. Simple as that. Now, this is a bad time for the Navy. It's a reasonable time for the Air Force at the moment. But I'll tell you, as of today, I'll tell you what ships we have got available at sea. I'll give you the list. Fingers of one hand. We've got one aircraft carrier. We've got two frigates, the Somerset and the St Albans. We've got 3 Type 25 destroyers. The Dragon, which is on its way to Cyprus. The Dauntless, which is going in for more repair. And the Duncan, which is off into the North Atlantic. That's it. And then we've got one attack submarine, the Anson, HMS Anson, which we sent to Australia. It now looks as if it's on its way back. That's it. 2 frigates, 3 destroyers, 1 aircraft carrier, 1 attack submarine. That's the Navy.
Are we building any? Are we building any?
Yes. And they'll be here in a few years' time. And that's why this crisis in Iran could not have come at a worse time for the Navy. Like all crises, it moves quickly. And every couple of days, it takes another turn, which just enhances the embarrassment of the Navy. The Air Force is doing a good job. We've got 12 Squadron, which is a joint British-Qatari squadron out in Al Udeid in Doha. They're doing a very hard job. We've got about 12 Typhoons at Akrotiri in Cyprus. They're doing a pretty good job. We've got some of the surveillance aircraft are working very hard, actually. So the Air Force has thrown itself at this, and they're doing quite a lot. And we've got other things as well, and the military are involved, the army are involved a bit. But this is the worst possible time for the Navy, because we've got ships tied up waiting to get into the maintenance facilities. The maintenance facilities have been so run down, we've got ships queuing up to get their maintenance done, and it's going to take 6 months, a year, 18 months, instead of a 1 month. If we were at war, they'd turn them around in 2 weeks. But now, 6 months, 8 months for that one, because we've reduced all the maintenance facilities to save money. I'll give you one final example of that. There's an RFA ship, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, the Lyme Bay in Gibraltar, which is being prepared for sea again. The Lyme Bay is active, it's an RFA ship, Royal Fleet Auxiliary, and it went back to Gibraltar on extended maintenance, right? So extended maintenance means 18 months. Now, and the reason it was being given extended maintenance for 18 months was so that we didn't have to pay the bill until next year. That's what you do when you're trying to save money on current spending. That's what you do. So that was tied up beside Gibraltar for 3 months. I think went in there in December. It's still there. They're trying to get it ready for sea again now.
I'm going to change tack briefly to China.
Sorry. No, one other thing I must tell you. Why don't American satellites locate the launching pods for the Iranians? Okay. Sorry. The very simple reason. It's called the TEL, Transporter Erector Launcher. They're all mobile. All of their missiles, their drones, their Shahid 136 drones, these very cheap things they use, there's 5 of them on the back of a truck. And so the truck pulls its tarpaulin off, and this kind of framework of 5 just goes up like that, off. And they're off within a couple of minutes. Even their big missiles, their ballistic missiles, even the Fatah 110, or the biggest of all, the Khorram Shah, they're all on the back of trucks. And so the trucks are leaving these, they call them missile cities, are buried. If you look at remember that other slide I showed you of the topography of Southwest Asia, you see how many mountains there are. They're buried, and they come out of their missile cities, and if they come to a prepared site, they can fire their missile within about 10 minutes. And if it's an unprepared site, it takes them closer to 30 minutes. And then they're going to lose the launcher, because the Americans then spot it, they attack it. So it usually only gets one launch, and the crew have to get out of the way. So every launch is probably costing them a transporter erector launcher. They're losing their launchability more than they are losing their weapons. But the reason that the Americans have got to wait for these things to come out is that they don't know where they are, or most of them they don't know where they are, until they appear, because they're mobile.
A few quick words about China.
Yeah.
Okay. Pretty much the same question, Pat Woodward. What will be the future for Taiwan following the current situation? Chris Nibbs, with Trump now distracted in the Middle East, will China seize the opportunity to take Taiwan? And Julie, what will Xi be making of the war in Iran? What will be the key take for him?
Yeah, Taiwan. The Americans always said that China would seize Taiwan before 2027, because Xi Jinping always said that he wants the Taiwan issue should be resolved while he is still in office. And his 3rd term comes to an end in 2027. He wasn't due to have a 3rd term, he's only supposed to have 2, and he's on his 3rd term now. But I don't think the 2027 date is very important, because he's obviously going to go for a 4th term, isn't he? And then a 5th one. He's quite young compared to Putin and Trump. He's quite a young man. And he certainly will go for another term. So I don't think 2027 is that important, actually, from what he said. And I think what the Chinese policy on Taiwan is not to invade it as such. They might. They want to keep that option open. But invading across 100 miles of water is not easy. And, there are all sorts of pros and cons. But the hardest thing that any military can do is launch an amphibious operation, D-Day style. And you've only got to look at the logistics of D-Day, which was across 60 miles, not 100 miles. You've only got to look at that to understand the amount that goes into it and the warning that the other side gets that you're preparing it. So I don't think that China is fixated on that. But what they are doing is what I would call the anaconda strategy, which is that they're squeezing Taiwan. So they keep having these maneuvers, very big manoeuvres. They've got 2 operational aircraft carriers now. Back in November, they had both of them at sea for the first time, both at sea with all their carrier strike groups with it. They're having a 3rd aircraft carrier will be available soon. And what they did in November, they practiced what they would do if they were going to invade by surrounding Taiwan without actually going into its territorial waters. They put a blocking force against Guam, which was to tell the Americans, if we do this and you try and come and help, we'll be there, we'll stop you, it's a blocking force. So they went through the whole panoply, and then they stepped it down, and then they stepped it up again, and then they stepped it down. And what they're doing is they're squeezing Taiwan, and they're trying to frighten everybody. And so the answer, I think, will be over a period of a couple of years, that the Chinese will say, look, this is going to go on, and we'll tighten the grip. And you'll find this more and more uncomfortable. So you know what the ultimate outcome will be. So look, do a deal now while we're in a reasonable frame of mind. Why don't you actually think about reintegration with us? And that's going to be their policy. And interestingly, this week, the Chinese are offering Taiwan a common energy policy because of the Iran crisis. They said, well, you know, we could link our energy with yours. We could make our energy available to you. Why not? And so it's a mixture of pressure and rewards. They're going to try to do it politically and get a leadership in Taiwan, the KMT, the Kuomintang, who are the party that do see China as their future one way or another. Chiang Kai-shek's old party. And if they get they haven't got a Kuomintang government at the moment, but if they get a Kuomintang government, then I think they think their political strategy would work over the longer term. That's what I think is likely to happen.
Israel and the US, some questions about that. And I mean, one's a sort of a long question from Jeff Elliott is basically asking whether the Israelis were spooked by Jonathan Powell saying that the Geneva talks between the US and Iran regarding nuclear program were that a deal was, quotes, within reach. I can't remember when that might have been said. So did that trigger it all off and drag Trump in? And Pete Gray wonders who's actually calling the shots. Is it Trump or is it Netanyahu? Would you like to talk about the balance of power there?
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows what this relationship is between Netanyahu and Trump over this issue. I mean, their relationship has varied. I mean, they've shouted at each other. They've been close. Trump has tried to cut ties with him and then made them up again. And undoubtedly, Netanyahu sees that Israel has a historic opportunity because he has a president who is prepared to back him in the grand scheme of making Israel safe for a generation by becoming the greater Israel, taking the West Bank and just pushing the Palestinians out to somewhere, that's their problem, taking southern Lebanon if necessary, pushing Hezbollah out or destroying Hezbollah, taking half of Gaza and then taking the whole of Gaza, enfeebling Iran, and then Israel will be safe and it will have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. So an enfeebled Iran, greater Israel, with a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia through the Abraham Accords that Jared Kushner, to his credit, actually, I think, negotiated during the first Trump administration. And so there's a narrow road by which you might see that there could be, in, say, 10 years' time, a much more stable Middle East. It wouldn't be a very equitable one, but it might be a more stable one if this Iran invasion worked for Trump, and if the Iranian regime collapsed and became more, at least secular, if not democratic, and if the greater Israel were created, which it's going to be in any case, I suspect. Never mind where that leaves the Palestinians, all 10 million of them, never mind that. There will be a relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Iran will be a different issue that can be managed in a different way. And out of that structure could come a more stable Middle East. So that's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. But Netanyahu sees that. He sees that as his goal. I mean, he's after big things. He's a man of destiny. Men of destiny are very dangerous. And he's a man of destiny because he knows that in Trump he has a president who, no other president would have done this. He has a president who will back him in this scheme. And no other president since Harry Truman would have gone anywhere near this sort of stuff. But that's what's happening. Did Netanyahu convince Trump to attack now? I don't think the Jonathan Powell thing had too much to do with it. I mean, what Powell was representing was only what the Yamanis had said. I mean, the Yamanis said we're close to a deal, and they were very upset when this attack started on the 28th of February. Baguri, the Omani foreign minister, he was very, very upset because he worked really hard on this. And I think Jonathan Powell was reflecting that. The sense was, yeah, there was a deal on the table, and the Israelis were very anxious that the Americans didn't accept it. The other thing that has come into the business is that the Chinese supplied Iran with a series of anti-ship missiles, drones, and ammunition, which they're entitled to do, and the Iranians have taken delivery of them. But they also talked only about supplying the Iranians with hypersonic missiles, in particular the D-47, and hypersonic missiles are impossible to, at the moment, to defend against. And one thought that is going around, and I can't prove whether this is true or not, is that the Israelis frighten the Americans by saying, if they get the D-47, then we're toast, because they'll use it against us, our Iron Dome system won't work, and they'll attack the United States with it as well. And the fear of this Chinese D-47 prompted Trump to say, okay, we'll go now. Now, that sounds a bit James Bondy to me, but that is doing the rounds as a possibility. And the Chinese have discussed the possibility of D-47 hypersonic missiles to Iran, but there's no hint that they've taken any action in that way. But it's circulated in the American media. Everyone's frightened of the D-47. We'll see. We'll see.
We've got so many questions, I think I need a one-word answer to the next
one.
You may have answered it in your talk. Adrian Cartwright, is there any chance of a military force of the willing keeping the Straits of Hormuz open?
Some, but not much. You've got to keep at it. It's much easier to close the Strait of Hormuz now than it was back in the days of the tanker war of the 1980s, because the technologies allow you to do much more. So it's not just sea mines, which is what existed then. There's robot boats, there's drones, there's air attacks, there's more sophisticated mines. So you don't have to close the straits, you just have to keep them dangerous. And they've only got to be a little bit dangerous before tankers won't go through. And you can see what's happening now. I'm sorry it's not a one-word answer, but I think you need to know this. Oil tankers, normally the insurance on an oil tanker is 0.5% of the value of the vessel. So 0.5% of the vessel value is what you pay for insurance to go through the Gulf. And that's gone up to about between 5 and 7% now. And so the issue for tanker owners, are you prepared, say the tanker costs 100 million, which a lot of them do, are you prepared to pay 7 million in insurance every time you go through the Strait of Hormuz? No, you're not. So you only have to present a small threat to effectively stop tankers going through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's now possible. Can you do something about it? Yes, you can, but you need a constant military presence. Air, sea, intelligence, and you've got to keep doing it. Keep doing it. So it can be done, but not with the military that is there at the moment. And not the American military can't do it on their own, actually. They've got no minesweepers, got rid of them. And the 3 vessels that do minesweeping jobs, which are their littoral combat ships, they have 3 of them with the 5th Fleet there. They've sent 2 of them to Malaysia for reasons nobody can fathom. They've actually sent 2 of their 3 minesweepers, in effect, away a week before Trump launched the attack.
We've got a lot of questions about Trump. So Eleanor Patton, as a first-year international relations undergraduate here, we spent time looking at the US and Russia. You mentioned Putin's fear of the West.
Yeah.
Getting closer, so what is Trump's fear?
Good question. I don't think he fears anything particular. Well, his fear is historical legacy. I mean, like all presidents in their second term, he worries now about what history will say about him. And we can guess about this. And of course, his fear is that things just won't work. And you know, I have to say that this Iran war is the biggest thing he's done. This is much bigger than the tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs. It's much bigger than his constitutional innovations, if that's what they are, within the United States. It's much bigger than the threat to leave NATO, which would be hard for him to carry out, given that Congress actually has legislation to prevent that happening. So it would be a constitutional battle. He just couldn't declare it and do it. So this war is far and away the biggest thing he's done. And I think what he fears must be failure. And of course, he won't entertain that because they'll declare victory and leave. That's the point. In a few weeks' time, 2-3 weeks, he'll declare victory and leave, and the Strait of Hormuz will be somebody else's problem. Because remember, the Strait of Hormuz, 90% of everything that comes out of Hormuz goes to Asia, goes to India, China, and East Asia. Only 10% goes to the rest of the world, Africa, Europe, United States. So he'll say, we don't want the Strait of Hormuz. No good. It doesn't matter to us. You're the guys who need it. You defend it. Having made the problem, he'll give it to everybody else to deal with. And that in about a month's time, I would guess.
I'd like to end on Trump on a short-term and a long-term question, okay? So Linda Sherwood, considering the resources being thrown at these wars in Ukraine and Iran, how long will it take for these protagonists to run out of weapons, drones, chips, etc.?
What, in the Iran war?
Well, she's saying Ukraine and Iran, so and the US is sort of engaged directly. So will they, in the short term, will they all run out of stuff? And the long-term question is basically, so has Trump, this is Ian Watson, has Trump thrown a spanner in the works of the alliance, or will things just revert when he departs? And Don Muir says, will we have to wait until 20th of January 2029 for today's mess to be sorted out?
Yeah. Okay, on the weapons thing, the United States is not going to run out of weapons, but for instance, it's Patriots. It produces effectively, about 2 a day of the missiles, and they've burned through about 600 in the Gulf so far, and so they're going to run out of Patriots. But there are other things as well. There are other weapons like the TAR, the high altitude theatre high altitude weapon. They're very sophisticated too. But the Americans have got plenty of stocks, but they're dipping into their stocks that they keep for Asia. You know, they have a reserve for the Indo-Pacific and a reserve for Europe and the Middle East, and they've used up their Middle East stocks easily. They've used up their European stocks, which are never high anyway in the last couple of years, and they're now dipping into their Asia stocks, and they can't replenish them so quickly. So they will run out of Patriots, not soon, but at some point. And there is some concern in the Pentagon about that they're dipping into stocks too much. The Ukrainians, in a funny sort of way, in a better position. The Ukrainians now, they only get about 20% of their weapons from the United States. About 40% come from Europe, and 40% are home-produced. And more Ukrainian weapons are being home-produced. And again, I can't say this strongly enough. The best army in Europe at the moment is the Ukrainian army, because they've been fighting for 4 years. They're very good. And the best weapons production process in Europe is the Ukrainian weapons production process. So if the Ukrainians hang on, if you see what I mean, easy for me to sit here and say that, if they hang on, then their weapons production will get more home-based, and there will be cooperation with countries like Britain, and there's a lot going on there, and with Germany, and with the Scandinavian countries. So their situation might improve. In the Middle East, they'll all be rethinking all of this, and the era of the Patriots may be declining because drones are so much cheaper. It's no good firing a Patriot at a drone. It's uneconomic. And I think we'll be looking at different sorts of defense systems. And then in the longer run, NATO. Will NATO recover after Trump? Not really. It may not be so badly off if after 2028, 2029. Depends who is elected. But there's no going back, just as there's no going back with Putin, there's no going back really with the United States. Whatever America we have after 2028, and of course it might be a MAGA Republican again, so it might last another 8 years after that. And that's a serious idea, a serious possibility. But whatever American president we have, NATO is different. NATO is different. Remember I said before, we knew we were on a glide path of 20 or 30 years. Trump made it into a cliff edge. But that glide path is that the United States is always going to now, in the 21st century, which is the Asian century, the United States is going to be more concerned with Asia than with the Atlantic. It still is interested in the Atlantic, of course, but it's more concerned with Asia. So the Atlantic is always going to have to look after itself more than it did in the past. But we'd like to do it on the basis of discussion and mutuality as opposed to coercion and threat.
I'd like to finish with a UK focus, and a series of different questions, but if we could just sort of quickly look at those. So Brendan Walsh starts off with, how would you advise Starmer in how to deal with Trump? Martin Drew, is it time the UK began to build cheap drones for warfare rather than million-pound missiles?
Yeah.
And then the other questions are more about, if we're being told to prepare for war, what does war look like today? How should we respond? That's from Francis Bromley. Linda Mottram is obviously concerned about more locally, sort of about emergency planning systems, outreach to local communities, and how can the defence review you've talked about be accessible to local communities at all levels.
Okay, let me do that last one first. National resilience forums, which already exist, now, some of them are very good, and there are ways of doing flood planning and all sorts of things, and outages, which we're going to see more of with severe weather and that type of thing. There's already a sort of a reasonable system of localised planning. We need to deepen it and bring more people into it, and people like yourselves are the people who are the backbone of these things, or tend to be, and that can be done. And it was all laid out in the Strategic Defence Review, but not enough has happened. That's the whole point we keep making. So there are lots of ideas around, and it wouldn't be difficult to do. It wouldn't be that difficult to do. Whether there's a generational difference, whether younger generation, Gen Z people would be so keen, we don't know. It's, the opinion polls on that, the MOD is always taking polls of Gen Z to try and get a sense of it, are not terribly encouraging, but that's partly because we haven't yet hit the sort of crisis that will generate that sort of sense of need, not anxiety, but need to get off and do something. So there is a possibility on that. What does warfare look like? Sixth generation warfare, it's known as, and sixth generation warfare is robotics, cyber, AI, and it's quite scary in a way, but we've got to go down this road because our adversaries are certainly going down this road. And there's lots of possibilities, and it is said that what we're aiming to do by 2035 is to take, say in the Army's case, a brigade. A brigade is a unit of combat, and take a brigade, 5,000 troops, and give it a tenfold increase in lethality, tenfold. So that it is more lethal, 10 times more lethal in 2035 than it is now, to anyone who comes within that brigade area, if it's warfare. Can it be done? People say, yes, it can be done, because the astonishing nature of sixth generation technologies with AI behind it is really quite something. And what the Army's thinking of is what they call the 40-40-20 version of war, and this is the way it works. That in a battle, say, and this is obviously very stylistic, the first 40% of weapons that you send are ones you don't expect to get back. They're drones and missiles, and they are deep fires. So you send them off, they're all kamikaze. That's the first 40%. The next 40%, you commit to the battle, you do want to get back. So these are the aircraft and things that come back, and the big drones that you want to use again. So they do a more specialized job. And then the last 20% are the men and the women and the tanks and the artillery, the human, the flesh and blood, that follows in behind the 40%, the 40%, and then the 20%. And that's the conception of sixth generation warfare. Whether it will work out that way, we don't know, but that's the direction in which I think we're going. And it's all based on the economics of cheap drones and laser fires. We have a system now called Dragonfire, which is going on the Type 26s next year, and it's a laser gun, and it costs about 50 pence a shot. 50 pence. Very, very cheap. Doesn't even use much power. Just pum, 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 laser fire. And it can, lasers are, it's not real James Bondish stuff. Lasers are great in some circumstances and not as effective as you might think in others. But nevertheless, that's, really quite something. And then, how should Starmer handle Trump? Kind of in the way that he is now handling him, which is to say, Mr. President, you follow your national interests and so do we. And that's, that he's learned that in a sense, Trump doesn't, he doesn't line up with losers. President Trump will never line up with the poor and the disadvantaged and those without a voice. He will only line up with the rich and the powerful and the greedy. And if you're not rich and powerful and greedy, all you can do is be honest with him and say, these are our national interests, this is it. And we're not going to be sentimental about the so-called special relationship. That went 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There are important bits of the British-American relationship which are still there, lower down, really important bits, which they value and we value in intelligence, some nuclear sharing between the armed forces. And I think you just got to be straightforward and honest with President Trump in that respect, and expect him to really, he just hits out. He takes pleasure in insulting Britain more than Germany or France or Italy. He used to take pleasure only in insulting Germany. He hates the Germans. But he's recently started to take real pleasure in insulting the Brits, as does President Putin. Both superpowers really despise us for different... When I say both superpowers, the current leaderships of both superpowers despise us more than they despise most others in Europe. And we just got to live with that. So, which means we've got to rededicate ourselves to who we are, what we stand for, and stand together.
What a remarkable and in-depth review of geopolitics with which to close our 45th season. I'm deeply grateful to Michael for being with us tonight. I hope that he'll be coming again in the not-too-distant future when perhaps the world will be a little bit brighter and more cheerful.
Yes.
That's the hope that I will leave with you as you leave until October. But I'm sure you agree with me. Great big thanks to Professor Michael Clarke.
Thank you. Thanks. Well done, Bill.
Thank you.